So our next and last panel for the day and the conference is discussed and moderated by Professor Edward Alpers. He's not with us here, but he is joining us over Zoom. We're just waiting for him to sign in, but I think we can... He did? Okay, so everyone's in, which is fantastic. But since Edward is not with us here, I can do the presentations. If I could please invite the panelists, Jane, Matthew.
Okay, we are ready to begin the final panel for today, the final panel for the conference. This is a hybrid panel, as you've all noticed. Thanks very much, Ned Alpers and Vijay Tilak, for joining us remotely. We greatly appreciate it. We look forward to your Vijay, your paper, and Ned, your comments. But I want to start by introducing Jane Hooper, Associate Professor in the Department of History and Art History at George Mason in the U.S. And the title of her talk this afternoon is The Memories of Shipmates, Claims to Freedom in Mauritius, 1830 to 1835. Please.
On December 19th, 1834, Lafleur, a 26-year-old Mozambique man, lodged a complaint with the Assistant Protector of Slaves in Mauritius. He declared that he should be granted his freedom. Is there anything I should adjust? Is that okay? There's a bit of, okay. 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 Lafleur claimed that he and a great number of others had been forced to depart East Africa. The Africans were taken to the Seychelles, landed at Silhouette, a small island in the Seychelles. The newly arrived Africans, including Lafleur, were marched into the interior and imprisoned on Silhouette for months. Then the Africans were transported, a few at a time, to Mauritius, alongside older enslaved people from the Seychelles who were to teach the new arrivals the, quote, Creole jargon during the voyage. British officials listened to Lafleur with interest. They were already investigating other accusations of illegal slaving on the same vessel. To support his account, Lafleur named several people he knew in Mauritius who'd been brought in the same ship from Africa to the Seychelles. Among these were two apprentices currently fulfilling their terms of work for the government. They had a meeting with Lafleur in the streets of Port Louis. The men, quote, instantly recognized him as their shipmate on the voyage from East Africa years earlier. Their testimony, combined with Lafleur's recitation of facts, led the British to conclude that he had been unjustly held in slavery. The assistant slave protector found that the validity of his account, quote, cannot be questioned. Moreover, the protector noted that he hoped to investigate the 17 people named by the three men, although there was a number of others that they, quote, know by their African names, but are ignorant of their present names and that of their masters. Lafleur was not alone in coming to the office of slave protector in Mauritius demanding his freedom. Dozens of others came forward in the months just before slavery ended. These people managed to escape from their enslavers, individually and in groups, and testified to their illegal enslavement. In bringing claims to the office of slave protector, they recited deeply personal histories that had been actively suppressed by their enslavers. Some of those who came forward sought to cast blame on their enslavers and traffickers by identifying these individuals and elaborating on their misdeeds. Many advocated for others, naming children or their shipmates as people who should also be granted their freedom. Several evidently believed that life as a government apprentice would be preferable to working for a violent master who would cause the death of their shipmates. What was striking was not the number of such appeals, given what we know about illegal slaving, but rather the details they were able to provide, especially about their shipmates. Despite having resided for more than a decade in the Mascarenes, the complainants maintained strong memories of those who had accompanied them during their many middle passages into slavery. Historians of the transatlantic slave trade have examined the strength of shipmate bonds for people who endured the passage from Africa. These bonds were crucial for Africans seeking to marry, engage in resistance, and practice religions in the Americas. Unsurprisingly, such bonds were equally tenacious in the Indian Ocean world, and indeed were necessary for those who hoped to win their freedom. So in the paper, I go into detail about the nature of these sources. I'll be skipping over a little bit of that today. I'm happy to talk during questions about this more in extent. But in the paper today, I want to give examples from testimony from these cases and use them to discuss the experiences of those who entered into slavery mostly between around 1815 and 1825 into Mauritius. I've examined these forms completed by the Office of Slave Protector during the 1830s for information about these experiences. So I'm going to use today these claims to investigate, first, the experience of enslavement in Africa, second, the experience of transportation, and then finally, the communities that the enslaved constructed after their arrival in Mauritius. So to begin with enslavement. For information about enslavement, details are generally lacking. For instance, one complainant, Helene, informed the British that she had been kidnapped and bought by African and Arab traders in East Africa. She was 25 at the time she made her claim in 1834, so she would have been quite young when she was enslaved, probably around 1815 to 1820. Her account supplies no additional information about her birthplace beyond referring to her as Mozambique, or even where she had departed East Africa. Likewise, Thomas Azor, whose name in Mozambique he told the British had been Mafta, he testified that he was carried off from Mozambique by the Arabs. He was brought to Madagascar, although he never mentioned where he arrived, and when he was sold to the white man who renamed him Thomas. He changed hands one more time before being brought to Mauritius. He noted that at the time of his final disembarkation, he was about, quote, 15 years of age, and now bore the name Azor. His emphasis on the frequent changing of his name would be echoed by others, marking a repeated moment of dislocation that was part of the larger process in which enslavers attempted to distance the new arrivals from their African or Malagasy roots. Enslavers in Mauritius did not rename people, such as Thomas Azor, because they wished to incorporate them into colonial society, but rather to hide their illegal transportation. When these new Africans were introduced to the Seychelles, or Mauritius, they were sometimes hidden in the slave registries by being renamed as people who had been sold or deceased. Hence, Mafta became Thomas, and later Azor, as his ownership changed hands. Those who embarked to Madagascar informed the British that they had been enslaved closer to the shores of eastern Madagascar. These individuals also identified their enslavers in Madagascar as people well known in Mauritian society. Jacques was a 30-year-old man who reported that his Malagasy name had been, quote, Lehay. When he was living in Madagascar, he had been in the service of an Indian named Paya, who brought him and several other natives of Madagascar and Mozambique to the port in eastern Madagascar. Paya oversaw their transportation and sale to landowners in Mauritius. After selling his captives, Paya returned to Madagascar and died shortly thereafter. Jacques informed the British that Paya's widow, however, was married to a man, and they lived together in the Malabar camp in Port Louis. Marie Josephine, age 40 in 1834, so one of the oldest complainants that we have, testified that at the time of her transportation, she was already a grown woman. She had been the mother of 4 children before leaving her country in Madagascar, although there's no mention of the children elsewhere in her testimony. She was bought in Madagascar by a Malabar man named Zephyr, who transported her to Port Louis alongside 3 others. Both Marie Josephine and a witness identified the slave trafficker by name, Zephyr, and by his ethnic identifier, Malabar, suggesting that he was recognized as a member of the Mauritian free people of color community, gens de couleur. An even more detailed account of enslavement in Madagascar was provided by a man named Nimor, about 25 years old at the time of his claim. He said he was from a part of Madagascar inhabited by the Betsimisaraka, and he'd been captured, alongside other children, by the Mbuilambo. The children were sold at Tomasina to a man named Robin, who was responsible for their shipment and sale to Mauritius. One of the enslaved people brought in to give testimony actually contradicted this story and asserted that Nimor was actually Creole and born in Mauritius. Unconvinced by this testimony, noting that it may have been given under duress, British officials were persuaded by the fact that Nimor could demonstrate that he could speak Malagasy. These accounts, gathered by the Office of Slave Protector, reveal how closely intertwined the societies of Madagascar, the Seychelles, and the Mascarenes were in the early 19th century. Throughout the course of their lives, enslaved people may regularly see the merchants, captains, and the mates they had met on ships carrying them to Mauritius, as well as their family members. But these close connections that existed between the islands suggest that somebody such as Nimor actually could have learned Malagasy while living in Mauritius, rather than having been born in Madagascar. So moving on to transportation. The cases underscore the extent to which people were illegally introduced to Mauritius, despite efforts to stem this traffic. Enslavers used the outlying islands of the Seychelles, including Silhouette, Praslin, Curieuse, for the unloading of illegally transported people. These islands were possessed by absentee landlords who employed overseers to supervise the production of low-profit crops. For instance, Pamela detailed how she and her sister and another African woman arrived at the Seychelles, where they labored before arriving at Mauritius. Others managed to avoid capture from British vessels through covert measures. Amboy was unloaded at Mauritius under the cover of darkness before his ship was seized, with several of his shipmates still on board. These people were apprehended by the British and became government apprentices on the island. Unbeknownst to the British, dozens of others from the ship, including Amboy, had already been concealed in a distant plantation, and unlike their confiscated shipmates, they would be sold and employed as slaves. People by Madagascar, by contrast, were often transported on vessels that ferried cattle from eastern Madagascar to Mauritius. The masters of these vessels engaged in legitimate commerce above deck. The enslaved were hidden below and cramped conditioned. People disembarked at night and were hurried into the woods or to a distant plantation where they were instructed on language and behavior. In other words, how they could appear to be Creole. Many new arrivals were sold in groups to purchasers willing to assume the risks involved in illegal slaving. Complainants offered descriptions of harrowing voyages from East Africa and Madagascar, as their captors tried their best to avoid British patrols. Slavers took circuitous routes and spent unanticipated days at sea with limited food and water. Helene stated that after landing in the Seychelles, the ship that had brought her, quote, went on the rocks and went to pieces. Petit Jean related that the ship he and his shipmates had arrived in had been chased and was run on shore and burnt by the British. Moving on to communities. Attempts by slave traffickers to evade the British shaped the experience of those illegally shipped by bringing them closer together. Time spent on small islands or at isolated plantations within Mauritius, with little mobility and contact with the outside world, may have contributed to community building among those enslaved, such as conditions did within the Atlantic. And here I'm referencing work by Alex Baruchi, Walter Hawthorne, among others. As illegally disembarked Africans in Malagasy created new communities in colonial Mauritius, they remained closer to their shipmates rather than new other enslaved peoples that they encountered in Mauritius. And they named these people as witnesses when they made their claims for freedom. Without fail, shipmates who were called as witnesses backed the cases that were brought before them. Men more often cited their male shipmates as witnesses, while women were more able to name their female shipmates. And this disparity was likely produced by the gender imbalances on board these vessels. So for instance, Helene came to the office and identified a woman named Jacquette as her shipmate. The women had been kidnapped and sold in East Africa by the same French slave trader. They were transported on a ship to the Seychelles and then to Mauritius together for both passages. And even after they were sold to different enslavers in Mauritius, they maintained contact. And she was able to provide the British with detailed information about this, her former comrade, as the British called her, including her location and her owner's name. Two men, one is named Zemmour and the other one Joseph, claimed to have been illegally transported from Mozambique. They sailed on the same vessel, disembarked at Praslin, a small island in the Seychelles, and they were brought to the interior of that island by 4 Mozambique sailors. After working for several weeks at woodcutting, they were sent to Curieuse, another small island, and ended up laboring on Mahi, the main Seychelles island, for a time before being brought to Mauritius. These men were able to name 27 people, all male, as accompanying them from East Africa to the Seychelles and then Mauritius, although they did note that several of their, quote, country people had died since their arrival. Evidence often came from apprentices as well, who were seen as giving more valuable evidence than those who were still enslaved. Note that despite the existence of distinct cultural communities in the Mascarenes, for those of African or Malagasy descent, the use of the term country people in testimonies seems to be instead coterminous with their shipmates, not people from the same country. It is clear in testimony that people were referring to their shipmates and not a broader population of people people in Mauritius who identified as Mozambique or Malagasy. In fact, those born in Madagascar often named shipmates who were East African, but shared passages with them to Mauritius. The sharing of a voyage and perhaps masters tied these individuals together despite their different birthplaces. The narratives provided by complainants instead highlighted their differences with those who were not shipmates. And I have some more details, but I'm not going to go into that now. Conclusions. So in February of 1835, enslaved people in Mauritius were legally declared apprentices, with domestics ordered to work for 4 more years, agricultural slaves for 6. Children under 6 years of age were declared free. Even though formal emancipation was on the horizon, people still came to the Office of Slave Protector in 1833, 1834, and even January, 1 month before emancipation of 1835, to appeal for their freedom. British officials during this time, in January, despaired of successfully investigating all of these assertions. And officials complained they didn't have enough people to work on processing these claims. So I began to ask myself, why so many claims just on the eve of emancipation? So throughout my paper, I argue that by renouncing enslavement as illegal, these individuals who approached the Office of Slave Protector sought to acquire the new social standing accorded to people who were freed prior to emancipation. In other words, it was less about freedom and more about their actual status that they would achieve from this. Other enslaved people in Mauritius were also attempting to self-emancipate throughout this period, and this is well known. However, these are not the only reasons why people approached the office. I would also argue that by coming forward to request their freedom, these people were able to share histories of oppression and share an indictment of those who enslaved them but lived on unpunished in Mauritius. The success of their testimonies relied upon social networks that had supported them and assisted them in maintaining memories of slavery and shipment. Even though there were people that Lafleur had not seen since his arrival in Mauritius, he remembered their African names. In so doing, he recognized their shared histories and passages into enslavement. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Now I'd like to invite Vijaya Tilak, who is the founder of the Center for Research on Slavery and Indenture, Republic of Mauritius, and former associate professor of history at the University of Mauritius. Vijaya, please.
Thank you to Sharjah Institute for having invited me. And I'm very envious of all of you sitting there in Zanzibar. So my paper is on the contribution of local historiography of slavery in Mauritius. And for some years, there have been calls for more attention to be paid to scholarly research and writing emanating from so-called ex-slave societies. So this presentation consists of some observations compiled over several years on the emergence of a local historiography of slavery and the directions taken in the production of local knowledge and how it differs from the historiography of slavery emerging out of outside ex-slave societies. Throughout this presentation, I will refer to local as being historical writing emerging from scholars and others based physically in the ex-colonies. I'll try to show that local insights are crucial to a full understanding of the societies we live in and should not be ignored. Instead, they should be actively sought for and researched and sought for. My reasons for undertaking this review. First is I've spent the last 40 years studying and researching Mauritian history. Having now retired, this conference presents the perfect opportunity to share with you what has been my lifelong ambition, to transmit and impart knowledge being acquired to Mauritians and to encourage Mauritians to research our own history. I'm not the only one to have had this goal. Many of my past and present colleagues were as eager as myself when we were young graduates, not only to study history for the sheer interest, but to disseminate it to as large a public as possible. I'm just going to share the screen, if I may. So this constitutes in some way a retrospective observation on the evolution of local historiography. The process of popularizing history started off quite a long time ago when I started teaching in a secondary school as a young graduate and realized that there were no age-appropriate books for them. Students simply learned by heart the notes provided by their teachers. I also hoped to encourage students to think outside official history and become more interested in history in general by examining their own lives, their family histories, and to study the history of their immediate environment. The aim was to show that history was indeed all around us. By studying this, I hope they would develop an interest in the discipline and undertake more study in the future. So this adventure, if I may term it as such, was a great learning curve for me as a historian, because I realized how sparse the information on the historical experiences of Mauritians was in books where authors used only archival sources. Many Mauritians could not identify with the history. I don't want to use a cliche, but it was dry history, all about great men, military, and ministers, narrated in a very uninteresting way, few human stories, and filled with statistics. So for me personally, Mauritian historical methodology had to include empirical evidence drawn from the ground, oral, ethnographic, material evidence, as well as incorporating people's ideas and life views. At the end of the day, this would lead us to a better understanding of people, ex-slave and ex-indentured societies. Even though we in Mauritius are living in a small and remote island state, almost the same size as Zanzibar, where you are sitting this afternoon, these islands have very complex colonial histories. They are also very extremely culturally rich, but diverse populations with most governments, colonial or independent, have had huge difficulties managing. More importantly for us, at the CRSI, which we founded in 2006, it was crucial to bridge the gap between scholarly and non-scholarly research, between researchers, communities involved, and civil society. We attempted to put this into practice through several research projects, events, living museums, workshops, and even international conferences. These conferences were eye-openers for the international participants who took part, as they had never before had their work on Mauritius being scrutinized by the local population. Many stated afterwards that they had found this an enriching experience and were very happy that their work was being popularized in such a manner and did not remain unread in expensive academic journals. I believe these encounters, bringing all these various groups together, led to the recognition that there were many non-academic researchers who had rich knowledge of their worlds, but had been ignored by the scholarly community. Sometimes we seem too focused on qualifications alone. The CRSI thus produced a voluminous amount of material, but regrettably, most of it was either not published or marketed only in Mauritius and has remained more or less unseen by outside scholars. What has been the contribution of local historiography on slavery? Overall, for me, the most important contribution has been to the construction of national identity and culture, and to bring formerly marginalized communities into the fold by unearthing the slave past and unearthing the histories of people who have been so much silenced in pre-independence and post-independence periods. On your screen, you have the inhabitants of the village of Lemon. Some of you know the iconic mountain of Lemon, and they were testifying here in 2010 about their forced displacement. Before the 1960s, Mauritian historiography was almost non-existent. Although academic history had begun writing in the 1930s with Auguste Toussaint, the first academic historian of Mauritius, his works were devoid of anything significant on the topic of slavery. Even when he spoke about trade, commerce, and shipping in Port Louis, the capital, he made very little mention of the slave trade, except in passing. He mentioned slave trafficking only in the annex, which contains a compilation of ships arriving in Mauritius, what we know as the Déclaration d'Arrivée. Since the 60s, there were attempts to create what some would label as national or nationalist history. Although the use of nationalist history may be today decried, I wish to point out that all countries need to have historians who contribute to telling the nation's history and create a historical narrative that all people can identify with. This sometimes explains why the academic perspectives and approaches of local and overseas historians of slavery do not necessarily converge. A challenge not faced by overseas scholars before the 1980s in Mauritius is that it was almost impossible to talk about the history of slavery openly, and some of you know this very well. Mauritian historians began to embark on that long road of breaking this taboo only in the 1980s. My own attempts in this very village that you see on the screen in the 80s and 90s to undertake oral history of slavery among descendants were unsuccessful. There were many refused to talk about the history of slavery openly. They were scared. Many of them were working for what we call the Big Five, land and former slave owning families, were still afraid of talking about their continued miserable situation. It was clear that they likened their situation to their enslaved and indentured ancestors and felt that labor exploitation had continued up to today. Over the years, two developments have occurred that changed the situation and the cultural context forever. First, there was the work of UNESCO, and of course, you all know of the Slave Route Project, which gave an immense impulsion and visibility to slavery in the Atlantic, and by default, to the Indian Ocean and Mauritius. It engendered and encouraged numerous outpourings, conferences, publications, because of course now, talking about slavery was respectable. The second major impulse came inevitably from the Creole intellectual elite, who spoke, wrote, and campaigned on behalf of descendants of slaves using the term Malaise Creole. So this term was coined in the 1990s, used to describe or highlight the phenomenon of social exclusion felt by many members of the Creole community. The fear of speaking out loud about the history of slavery was just gradually dissipated. Although I'm focusing on local historiography, I must state that Mauritian historians, including myself, have been and continue to be greatly inspired by French and American scholars who have encouraged local scholarship in the past 3 decades. Most of you already know these names: Edward Alpers, the late Hubert Gerbeau and Claude Banquet, Nigel Warden, Richard Allen, Pierre Lawson, and Thomas Vernet, amongst others. Through their work, they have in a sense campaigned for the Indian Ocean to be recognized as a distinct regional entity with a very distinct history of slavery and emancipation compared to Atlantic models. Their works and their experience have offered us in Mauritius rich insights to further our own work here. So I wish to thank them publicly for their contributions to Mauritian historiography. The new Mauritian historians were officially supported by the state, which advocated a Mauritianization of the school curriculum. This official support allowed the holding of a very first conference on slavery in 1985 at the Mahatma Gandhi Institute. For the first time, Mauritians were talking about the history of slavery openly with other scholars. To date, the contribution of researchers, therefore, has been essentially in restoring facts of Mauritian history without having to undergo censoring. There were still, however, some reticence and hesitant behavior. For example, my own book, Bitter Sugar, was not sold in many bookshops because the owners were afraid that they would lose their rich white clientele. Studies on plantations, on economic history, hit at the core of the slave system in Mauritius. From the 1990s, we witnessed the emergence of a more interdisciplinary research as the limitations of the archives were being felt. Unlike the situation in the Atlantic, we could not find many sources emanating from slaves and could not hear the slave voice. Material evidence of the life of the slave in particular was missing for the period of the 18th century. Where were the slaves buried? Where did the slaves live? How was life inside a slave camp? What was the daily life of the slave? Archaeology, ethnography, oral history all came into play and were added to the archival data to better understand the history of slaves, slavery, and Mauritians of African and Malagasy descent. In 1998, a young historian, Joyce Fortuné, undertook pioneering research using oral history and traced ancient traditions related to slavery and marronage. Her work had a ripple effect. Further work by Joyce on her family origins inspired other families to use oral history to try and discover their Afro-Malagasy origins and traditions. Related to this was the beginning of an important project, namely the Origins Project, based at the Nelson Mandela Center for African Culture. The project lasted about 4 years. This project also led to the creation of a family history unit with the goal of helping Creole families of African origin search for their African origins and slave origins. To complement the work of the Nelson Mandela Center, a few years ago at the university, we launched another website, which you can see on your screen, where viewers could listen to families recounting their family histories and where the difficulties of tracing family roots was highlighted. Also in 1998, the University of Mauritius started teaching archaeology and heritage for the very first time, with Dutch archaeologist Peter Lafleur giving students field experience on the Dutch settlement in Mauritius. Several other pioneering studies were begun, including the Maroon Cave Archaeology Project on your screen, where the discovery of many caves used by maroon slaves all over the island led the government to be able to make a bid for one iconic mountain, Le Morne, to become a World Heritage Site. An abandoned cemetery was also found very near to the mountain, and this was excavated with the village inhabitants. The report has also been published. More recently, we've become in-depth long-term archaeological excavations into the site of the Moulin à Poudre. So this site is the only French gunpowder making factory in the Indian Ocean, where more than 400 slaves belonging to the French colonial government worked. Here too, the project allowed for some misconceptions that had existed about slavery to be confronted and accepted, I think. Few were aware of the existence of governments or public slaves. Many refused to acknowledge that there was indeed a slave hierarchy and that some slaves were more privileged than others. In one conference I attended in La Réunion Island, many in the audience refused to accept that government-owned slaves were paid for their work, despite the archival evidence that I had shown. And they stated that the government slave could not be termed slaves. Even the cover of our book, which you see on our screen, an artist's impressions showing slaves became polemical. In parallel to the work of researchers, the work of activists, groups campaigning for the recognition of slavery as a crime against humanity became more forceful. The Michel brothers, here you see Silvio, one of the brothers, Silvio and Elie, called for investigations on the possibility of reparations on the wrongs caused by slavery. Their campaign for a reparations commission lasted over 20 years. Their voice was finally heard in 2009 when the Mauritian government decided to set up a presidential commission, the Mauritius Truth and Justice Commission, the TJC. Its main mandate was to study the consequences of slavery and indentured labor and to make recommendations. So it was quite a symbolic moment when the TJC began its work. The first person to be invited to testify, of course, was Mr. Silvio Michel, whom you can see on the screen. And on your right, I think, this is the petition. It had nearly 3,000 or 4,000 signatures of people wanting to testify in front of the commission. There was some groundbreaking research undertaken in the commission. This is the communique that was published in the newspaper inviting people to come and testify. So groundbreaking research was undertaken with a team of nearly 50 Mauritian and foreign researchers, published in November 2011, contains 6 volumes. 4 volumes had 2,888 pages and 290 recommendations, and 2 further volumes in digital format containing audio and video material. So one of these pioneering studies was in a former slave camp, which had become by the 20th century into a slum. And the study by Sophie Le Chartier, she looked at genealogy, history, anthropology, sociology, GIS mapping, etc., and found that in this village, almost everyone was related. And they all came, as you can see on the map, in the red dots, they all came from one particular region. Are you okay? So the next slide, please. Another example of the importance of local historiography in providing reference material for important cultural projects is the Slavery Museum project. This project also had been one of the recommendations of the Truth and Justice Commission since 2011. 3 international workshops were held in Mauritius since 2016 concerning slavery museums, one with the participation of the UNESCO's Slave Route project. These workshops fostered much discussion and collaboration between academia, cultural institutions, activists, and civil society. It began to be implemented in which is by what they call a special purpose vehicle, which is a state company. But without the joint campaign led by researchers and civil society, the museum project would, in my mind, have taken much longer, if at all. I would like to conclude by saying that for me, the principal contribution of local historians has been to bridge the gap between historical reality, public perceptions of its history, and bringing in civil society in ways that overseas scholars, given their short stay in Mauritius, cannot. Although many historical advances have been made by historians in Mauritius, local and overseas, we should not rest on our laurels. It won't be before several generations have passed that the psychological scars of slavery and its aftermath will be overcome. As I speak today, the first French-produced fiction film ever made on slavery and marronage is being filmed with historical inputs from French and Mauritian historians. All the taking place in Mauritius with French, Senegalese, and Mauritian actors. It has been very difficult. I can say that from the bottom of my heart for the French crew and for Mauritians to watch some of the scenes being filmed. As a historian of slavery, even though I know the scenes are not real, being set in places that are so familiar to us is just too close to home. Whether we'll be ever able to see this film on public screens in Mauritius is open to question. We feel that despite all the research produced by all the historians of Mauritius, outside and inside Mauritius over 5 decades, some still feel Mauritians are still not yet ready to face the truth about their history. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the final paper of the panel by Matthew S. Hopper, Professor of History, University of California. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. And I'm so used to saying University of California that I should say California Polytechnic State University at San Luis Obispo. The name of Matt's talk today is Creating a Public Database of Slaving Voyages Across the Indian Ocean and Asia. Matt, please, the floor is yours.
Should I begin? Okay, all right, great. Many thanks to the Africa Institute and to the organizers of this conference. Today I'm going to be presenting on behalf of a team of researchers, including Jane Hooper, who's here, as well as Richard Allen and Daniel Dominguez, who are working to create a public database of slaving voyages across the Indian Ocean and Asia. And this new initiative is funded by a National Endowment for the Humanities Digital Projects for the Public Production Grant. And it's going to work to incorporate the Indian Ocean and Asia into the existing transatlantic slave trade database, which is now publicly available on slavevoyages.org. So in today's presentation, I'm just going to briefly outline the goals of the project and why it's needed, and I'll introduce the research team and tell you what's been done so far. And then I'm going to conclude by a call for your assistance. And you all can contribute to this growing database, and I'll share some information on how to become involved. So first of all, what is the project? So the project is going to work to create and incorporate an Indian Ocean and Asia database into slave voyages, which currently includes databases on the transatlantic slave trade as well as the inter-American slave trade, and then individual enslaved Africans through the African Names Project, or the people of the Atlantic slave trade. Those are all on the existing website. And I'm sure all of us are aware of this website and used it in teaching or for research purposes. But what you may have noticed is there aren't a lot of Indian Ocean voyages there because it's really concentrated on the transatlantic trade. So there are about 900 Indian Ocean voyages already on there. But there are a lot of voyages that aren't. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how this project intends to add several thousand more voyages to to this database. So recent scholarships demonstrated that millions of enslaved men, women, and children from Asia, Eastern Africa were shipped throughout the Indian Ocean world, and maritime Asia to the Americas, to other parts of Africa, to the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, as well as even across the Pacific to the Americas between the early 16th century and the 20th century. And research has so far identified about 2,800 slaving voyages in the Indian Ocean. These voyages underscore the pressing need for scholars to appreciate the globality and the multidirectionality and the complexity of the transoceanic movement of human labor since circa 1500, and slave labor in particular. So why is this project needed? The history of the global slave trade is really only partially written. The transatlantic slave trade database, as of now, has more than 36,000 voyages that detail the voyages that carried more than 12 million enslaved people from Africa to the Americas. Recent scholarship has expanded our understanding even further. So the new intra-American database, which is on slave voyages, as the second tab you can see here, also adds another 27,000 voyages of another 600,000 plus people between 1619 and about 1860. And we've also now got new digital humanities projects, including Henry Lovejoy's newly relaunched on the 1st of June Liberated Africans website, detailing hundreds of thousands, many of whom we have names for. And some of these names are actually included in the Peoples of the Atlantic Slave Trade database. So slave voyages already includes more than 900 slave voyages to the Americas that originated in the Indian Ocean, but there are many more out there that have been identified that simply aren't on slave voyages yet because of its transatlantic focus. And these voyages were bound from Africa to Arabia, the Mascarenes, or from South and Southeast Asia to European colonies around the Indian Ocean, including the Cape of Good Hope, and then many other origins and destinations for which enslavers were non-Europeans. And we have lots of European voyages. But in the Indian Ocean, of course, we have many non-European voyages, and these simply aren't there on slave voyages yet. So what I'd like to do is just introduce, if you've used this website as a source, more than likely it would be for teaching purposes or research purposes. So you can access the database directly and do very precise searches, or you can use it as a teaching tool. And frequently, people in education use the time-lapse feature, in which each of the slaving voyages is identified by one of these dots, and they're color-coded to the flag of the country that's doing the transporting, and then each dot is represented by a group of captives. And you can click on each one of these, and you'll notice that some of them already are Indian Ocean voyages. So here is a Portuguese-Brazilian ship from 1830, for example, which has a route from Mozambique to Brazil. And it's one, as you can see, of many similarly colored green dots. The larger the dots, the larger the cargo, so the larger the size of the number of captives on board. And there even are some voyages that actually are not transatlantic voyages at all, because they are captured by the British Royal Navy, and they may be captured in the Mozambique Channel, and they end up in Mauritius. And there are a couple that are already up there on slave voyages. But there are many more voyages that aren't there. And so this project enables us to ask the question, what if? What if there were a central clearinghouse for researchers interested in the history of the African diaspora, interested in the history of slavery and the slave trade? What if we could combine the work that we're doing and have a central place where some of them are private databases that people are using to write their own books, but some of them are also public humanities projects. But what if they could come together just like Slave Voyages allows right now, so that each of these dots in the time lapse, or each of these cases or voyages that's currently on Slave Voyages, provides a number of different sources. I teach a class at Cal Poly on the history of the transatlantic slave trade, and each student in that class writes an individual research paper, 10 to 20 pages, on one slave ship. And it has to be a ship that's in slave voyages, and I provide primary sources from the Admiralty records that I've photographed, and the students each engage in that, but they start with slave voyages. They start with one of these entries, and they look at the sources. How does the slavevoyages.org website, how does it know about this voyage? And they find those original sources, if they're in FO84, or if they're in the Irish University Press slave trade volumes, or if they're in the parliamentary papers, etc. And they find these. But the question is, what if there was something like this for the Indian Ocean? And so the background on this is Richard Allen has been looking for slave voyages since 1995, has been documenting them in a private database that he's maintained. And he gave a presentation in Amsterdam in 2018 calling for a database like this and proposing one. And he became connected with Jane Hooper, who's here, who is on the slave voyages team. On the ward, and along with Daniel Dominguez. And so we put together a grant proposal in 2021 to the NEH to fund expanding slave voyages to include the Indian Ocean. And it was unsuccessful, unfortunately. But we didn't give up. We put the proposal back out a second time, and that time it was approved. So I wanted to just give you a quick example of how this would be useful. So we're certainly very aware of the limitations of importing what is currently a transatlantic model for tracing slave voyages into the Indian Ocean, right, where the situation is vastly different. We're aware of those limitations. We're also aware of the ethical issues, right? And we've already talked at this conference about the risks of doing this kind of quantitative work, which runs the risk, the very real risk of reducing human lives to numbers, right? But this is not a census project. And this is not an end point. It's intended to be a beginning point, right? So I'm working on a book project on liberated Africans in the Indian Ocean world. And so I'm looking at 7 different primary places where the British took enslaved Africans off of slave ships that they captured in the Indian Ocean and transported them to places like Mauritius and the Seychelles and Bombay and the Cape of Good Hope. What if the research that I've been doing could connect with the work that Jane has just described, or the work that some of you are doing? What if there was a central clearinghouse where I could become aware of your work and all these public humanities projects could sort of come together? So we envision something like this through the already existing, it's sort of the gold standard for public humanities projects, slave voyages. And so yeah, I'm very happy to tell you that that new grant proposal was approved and it is funded, and our first year of funding just began in March. And we had a conference in the fall and invited out some experts to inquire about how to best proceed. And so we have, in addition to the 4 of us, that includes Richard Allen, Daniel Dominguez, and Jane Hooper, and myself, we have assembled a group of humanities advisors. And those include Edward Alpers and Nafis Khan, Kate McMahon, the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, Hideaki Suzuki, who's here, Carrie Ward, Wendy Wilson Fall, who works on Madagascar, and others. And then we held a conference at Rice and brought out experts to advise us. And those included Ned Alpers and James Armstrong and Clara Boyer, Pedro Machado, Nafis Khan, Chris Saunders, Hideaki Suzuki, Chaplain Toto, Dominique Sonda, Carrie Ward, Nigel Warden, Beninga Zimba, and Wendy Wilson Fall. So we assembled at Rice to ask this question: could this be done? Knowing the limitations, could something like this be done? And we're excited to be moving ahead. So our goal is actually by this August, at the end of this summer, to have assembled the first 300 voyages. And between the 4 of us, we already are aware of and have documentation for 2,800 voyages. So you think about a database that currently has 36,000 voyages, expanding that by another nearly 3,000 voyages is already a really wonderful opportunity. But there's also an opportunity for you to become involved, and I'll close with that. But first, let me just make a connection here. So the Africa Institute is in Sharjah, and has already been mentioned by Professor Sharif. One of the world's leading experts on the Gulf is actually the Sheikh of Sharjah, who's written a book on the myth of piracy. And so you know, if you've seen the book, The Myth of Piracy in the Persian Gulf, is that in the year 1819, Ras Al Khaimah and other Qawasim towns on the Trucial coast were bombarded by 3 British Royal Navy vessels, supplemented by about 6,000 Omani soldiers. But these 3 vessels shelled the port cities of the Trucial coast in 1819. And there was an attack. And leading this attack actually was this vessel right here, the HMS Liverpool. So let's just say, hypothetically, you were interested in this ship, the HMS Liverpool, which sails to the Gulf and bombards what's today the Emirates. And you may do a bit of background research and discover that that very same ship, just a few months before it pulled into the Gulf, actually stopped at Mauritius to deliver captives who were aboard 3 slave ships that were all captured in succession in the summer of 1819. So it's on its way to the Gulf it actually captures 3 slave ships. What happens to the people on board, and how might it connect with a project like the one that Jane is doing with slave testimonies? It's entirely possible that the work I'm doing could connect with Jane's work, because we're both not particularly interested in quantitative work, to be really frank. We don't just assemble databases to count people and to do a census, but it's the starting point, right? It's the place where it's the entry point for us, because we're interested in lives and how people's lives were disrupted through enslavement. And we're interested to know what happens to people and what happens to their descendants. So the project I'm working on has a lot to do with British colonialism and the treatment of people who were quote unquote liberated from slavery, but only to be indentured, right? And to be taken to places where their labor was in high demand. And so I'm interested in the treatment of these people, which is, I argue, really strongly influenced by scientific racism, which by the mid-19th century has completely infiltrated every aspect of abolition. And so if I were to find the record of these 3 ships and Jane were to find them, our work could potentially come together on slave voyages, and here's how. So the work that I've been doing is with the High Court of Admiralty records. There's a completely uncatalogued and unindexed 89-volume record set in the National Archives in the UK. And what I've been doing over the last 6 years is on short trips, 7 to 14 days, doing my own research, which is much more micro-historical. But at the same time, as long as I have a little bit of time, I'm photographing these volumes. And I've been bringing them back and putting my students to work in indexing it. And I'm happy to announce that as of January, we have now indexed all 89 volumes. And this is what it looks like. So there are, don't thank me, my students have done it. But they've worked really hard on this. But we now have, I think it's 9,700 entries from these 89 volumes. Each volume is between 400 and 800 pages, so it's absolutely massive. But it contains every single slave ship that was captured by the British Royal Navy between 1820 and 1897. And then we've been taking that. One of my graduate students, Zach, who's preparing to defend his thesis and graduate, has been plotting these using GIS. And so we have the Indian Ocean voyages, which are certainly a smaller subset. Most of these are Atlantic. But we could actually identify the very same ships that the HMS Liverpool captured in the summer of 1819. And they may actually overlap exactly with the period that Jane's working on. And so our data could potentially intersect at this new clearinghouse, right? We could call it the Indian Ocean page on slave voyages. So slave voyages now has got the transatlantic, and now it's got the intra-American, which Greg O'Malley and Alex Barucki have been working on for years and is now available. And people are now doing this kind of genealogical work where they can identify people in their family history who were aboard one of these voyages and could potentially link it up to a transatlantic voyage. What if we could do the same thing in the Indian Ocean? So the work that I've been doing is to then find out what happens to people. So one of these ships that's captured is taken to Mauritius, and this is a register of all the people who are on board. And this actually goes on for almost 300 people. But we have their names as well as their age, and there's a note about whether they're Malagasy or Mozambique, the age, their sex, their stature, and then also distinguishing marks. And sometimes these can reveal something about who's claiming ownership over them through brands. And so we're doing some research on brands. But also some of these actually have descriptions of what people look like that are apart from brands, including patterns of facial scarification, which we can align with 19th century ethnography and identify potentially with certain ethnic groups in Mozambique that were doing this kind of facial scarification and tattooing. So these registers, which are from the Cape of Good Hope, which William Swan Field was very meticulous in drawing the particular patterns of facial scarification and tattooing, could be compared with 19th century ethnographies to potentially trace ancestry. And we can link these with names, and these names could be associated with voyages, and the work that you all are doing could potentially connect with the work that we're doing. So I'm interested in what happens after people are removed from these ships, and the short answer is they're all indentured. But we could potentially, because these indentures, although they're very formulaic, they're following a template, the name is on here, right? And if we're going to give dignity to the history of these individuals whose lives are upended by enslavement, it really starts with a name. And if we have a name, and we have something like this, a certificate of indenture, or as Preben, just to make a connection, saw in Durban, there's also the certificate ending somebody's indenture. And sometimes these reveal information about where people end up, who they're indentured to, and it gives us some clues about whose records we could look at to find additional information about what happens. And these could potentially be linked up with the kinds of work that's being done in the Caribbean and the Atlantic by people like Jane Landers, right? What happens when all of these publicly accessible humanities projects could potentially be linked up so that birth records and marriage records and death records could be potentially linked with these voyages and with other people who are on board these ships. So I've been going to different places around the Indian Ocean to try to find these registers, and Preben's found some really excellent ones as well. He mentioned the Seychelles ones, which are, as far as I know, the only ones on Earth that use actually photography. And this is work that lines up really nicely with the work that Henry Lovejoy has been doing. So Henry just gave this fantastic presentation at a conference in Canada on June 1st and relaunched his Liberated Africans website, which had limitations before, but now it does something really remarkable. You can click on the Maps tab, and he has identified every slave ship, I think, captured by the French, the Brazilian, by the British, and he's got them all also displayed on an interactive map. So you could click on each one of these images and see the details about the voyage, including those of us who have worked with him and have donated our data sets, where to find the records of those individual voyages. So I'm excited that the work that we're doing that looks like this, which looks very quantitative, and we're very open and receptive to that kind of criticism that we are, in a sense, doing a form of violence, right, with this archival material and reducing, these people's experiences to numbers. But I just want to emphasize that we're not stopping there, right? I mean, this is a database that could potentially link researchers to one another and help trace the lives of people who actually experience this disruption, have experienced this themselves. And so the work that I'm doing is very much micro-historical, looking at each voyage and looking at the people who are on those. And we're not trying in any way to create a census here. We're just trying to create a resource that will allow researchers to connect with one another. So it looks like I have exactly a minute left. So let me, with that time, tell you how you can become involved. So if you haven't already gotten an email from Richard Allen, you can expect one if he knows you. He's been actively reaching out to people who he knows have been collecting voyages. But if he hasn't, Jane and I are happy to get emails from you and connect you to, we'll have a sort of an intake form, which will be it will be eventually online like it is with Slave Voyages, where you can contribute information. And the idea is to engage with the public so that people can not only find information here, but also contribute information. So if you find information about a voyage that could be added to this database, there'll be a space for you to enter in fields. You may only know one or two fields, but that's still a point of data that we can add to this database, and most importantly, the source where you're finding that. So Jane and I are both happy to receive emails from you and incorporate the work that you're doing. So those of you who are already actively researching slavery in the Indian Ocean, which is many of the people in this room, we want to engage with you if you're willing to share your data, so that your work might intersect with ours and also intersect potentially with the families of descendants who are actively seeking genealogical information about their ancestors. All right, well that's it. All right.
It's my pleasure to introduce Edward A. Alpers, Research Professor of History at the University of California, Los Angeles. Although it's late in the day for us.
Recording in progress.
Although it's late in the day for us, Ned, I know it's very, very early in the morning for you.
Yes, it is.
So thank you very much for joining us. We've asked Ned to comment on the papers in our final panel. So please, Ned, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Well, first of all, I want to thank the Africa Institute for organizing this wonderful conference. I wish I could be there, but as I told Jeremy, tomorrow's our 60th wedding anniversary, and I wasn't about to be in Zanzibar for that. But also, I really want to thank the Africa Institute for having the live streaming, because yesterday I was able to watch many of the panels, and Jeremy also forwarded several of the papers to me. So I've actually felt that I was there for part of what all of you have experienced. And so thanks to the Institute for doing this, because it really makes participation much more real. The second thing I want to say is it was interesting. This, in a sense, Matt Hopper's paper is a perfect bookend to where the conference began with Abdul Sharif talking about the history of quantification, starting with Phil Curtin in 1960. Which very much was part of cliometrics and counting and all of that. And as we've just heard from Matt, the whole point of adding the Indian Ocean to the slave voyages database is to make it possible to do much more fine-tuned research that will actually get at the experience of the people who were enslaved during this long period. So I think it's important to acknowledge that there's been a long history, a long and very interesting history that goes back now over 60 years, looking at these issues. One thing I want to say, and I think everybody there is aware of it, is that the conference and the papers very much concentrated on the Western Indian Ocean and on the African experience. But if one is looking at the history of slaving and of slavery in the Indian Ocean, even in the 19th century, it also involves the Eastern Indian Ocean. The only paper that actually has a specific reference to it, the ones I've seen, is Jane Hooper has a small section in her paper on a group of so-called Malays who claimed went to the protector of slavery in Mauritius in 1834 to claim their freedom. But it's important to understand. Even though Matt didn't talk about it particularly, within the meeting that we had at Rice last October. This is very much part of it. And so the whole Dutch experience in Indonesia, among others, needs to be in the long run will be involved in the slave trade in the Indian Ocean aspect. The other thing that strikes me in listening to all these papers, and actually the language that was used in many of the papers, is very much a focus on microhistory. And it's interesting because there's been a series of monthly seminars from the University of Paris, Paris, Thomas Vernet and Samuel Sanchez in particular had directing. And the last paper was by Sue Peabody, who's of course known to those who know the historiography of Mauritius and the Reunion for her book on Madeline's children. And what Sue's doing is very much like what Jane is doing, is looking at a single shipment. Well, it's actually two shipments by the same ship from Zanzibar to Mauritius in the 1820s, which gets captured, and then she's interested in following up on all of this. And she's very explicitly, she's not only saying that she's doing microhistory, but in a series of papers, she defines what she means by microhistory, which I think is important to mention here. She says specifically, quote, that it's explicitly to consider the historical forces that produce the archives. And I think that the way in which Matt ended up pointing to the need to identify the specific archive. Any voyages you might find come from but also how they were constructed. But also how they were constructed. In Preben's talk, he talked about the structure of the British, of course, had information. The British, of course, had very specific forms they used. These forms were adopted by the Portuguese in many cases. But trying to take all this disparate data and get it into a common database when it's not necessarily being produced in the same way is really important. And it's important to understand why the British or the Portuguese or the French or the Danish or anybody else were actually acquiring this information. What did they want to do with it? Because that's as important as what. In other words, as I think Sue has said, reading it, and I think Jane also says, reading these documents with the grain as well as against the grain. So So I think it's been really interesting to me that people are focused on microhistory, and that this involves also different strategies in the archives. And I think what Vijaya had to say about local history is important in this context. That there are many ways to get at to try to get at the experience of people who were enslaved or who were liberated from slavery. And I think one thing that's occurred to me as I've been reading through these and listening to people speak is also there's the continuum to indentured labor, not just the indentured people who had been enslaved directly, but the whole history of indentured labor, which of course for which Mauritius is the testing ground that eventually spreads to Fiji and to Trinidad and other places in the Caribbean. So it will be interesting, and I can't remember if we talked about this at Rice in October, but in many respects, well, to go beyond liberated Africans, to take the experience of people who are, it may not have been another form of slavery, depending on who you want to believe in terms of indentured labor. But it certainly is a form of imposed labor on people, and I think that's something that could lead to some very interesting details post-slavery in the Indian Ocean world. In terms of Jane's Hooper's paper is fascinating because it resonates with what's been done in the Atlantic on shipmates, and what it implies is that she's looking at a specific set of materials. But we've seen other papers. Tabiti Willis's paper on mapping routes. We've seen mapping in Hamat's paper. Every one of these ships took enslaved people from one part of the Indian Ocean to another part. They all had a similar experience, different but similar experience. They were all confined in a space for a certain period of time, who may have been held at the coast. A lot about something at least about how people exchanged ideas and learned languages depending on how long they were held at the coast. So that whole notion of shipmates should not be considered just to relate to the work that Hooper's doing, but is a potential for other areas. So, for example, looking at the Gulf, you think of Hideaki Suzuki's paper, which doesn't say anything about shipmates. It would be to ask the question: Did people who ended up in the Gulf, wherever they were, whether they were pearl divers or dock workers or soldiers, did they also have the same experience and have networks constructed of the people they had been transported with, not only by ship but also moved if they were in groups on land. And I think that kind of thinking about people in terms of their affiliations and their affines in a certain kind of a way. Also relates to what Suzuki says about marriage and family, all of these kinds of concepts, which are incredibly important to giving people a place to feel. As Alan Ogott's famous phrase in talking about churches in Western Kenya, a place to feel at home. These are all people who were uprooted and who had to find in some other way, whether it was shipmates or the kinds of marriages that were made, or the kinds of relationships they had with their masters' families. All of these things come together and require us, obviously. I mean, it's sort of mother's milk for historians, but how to critically read our sources. is really important. Among the other kinds of things that so I think we need to think about the comparability of the archival sources that we have. A question that comes up in several of the papers, and in Jane specifically, and in some ways is implied by what Vijay Tilak says about the production of local quote local histories. What is the truth of testimonies? There's the truth. Matt Hopper specifically talked about the scientific racism that infused the whole abolition movement. And one thing that people haven't mentioned is that when British Navy ships freed captured slavers, there was a reward. They got paid. Per capita, and so there's everybody's got a hand in this, and has got an interest in it, and I think the interests of those who do the liberating, the interests of masters, owners, shippers, all of these things need to be considered, and that's clearly the value of microhistory, to get at what the experience of the enslaved actually was. So the whole question of the truth of testimonies is really important. Whether you're enslaved, freed, petitioners, to what extent did people embellish what they said or invent their backgrounds? And also, how truthfully all of this was taken down. Matt, as some of you know, Matt and I did a paper some years ago in the NAL called Speaking for Themselves, which is the whole process of translation is important, and very often not looked at. It's just taken, verbatim, but that's not the case, as several of the papers earlier in the conference talked about. Abdul in his keynote in particular, how do you read Abd in the Quran? What does it mean? Does it really mean? Does it mean slave? Does it mean servant? So attention to language is important in all of this. So I think I guess. What all of these. And one of the other things is how people were defined, externally, and how they self-defined themselves, and how they self-presented themselves. Jeremy's done some of the most important work on renaming of enslaved people in Zanzibar. But I think it's interesting that saying that people were Swahili or from Zanzibar, as it said, were they really from Zanzibar, or were they probably enslaved somewhere in East Central Africa and made their way through Zanzibar? And there's so you get these common terms like Zanzibaris or Mozambiques. One of the things that is fascinating about the ship that Sue Peabody talks about is this is 1826. It's a ship that goes from Zanzibar to Mauritius. But the enslaved people are called Mozambiques. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that, did they come from Mozambique? Were they shipped from Mozambique up to Zanzibar? So these kinds of labels are in some cases, not even very useful for telling us where people came from, unless you know the actual ship that carried them. So I guess in the last comment, let's see if there are any other specific comments that I want to make about this. So I think mapping. We've several of the papers and certainly came out in Matt Hopper's paper too. But also mapping as a methodology is very helpful. It's like the quantification aspect of things, knowing how these movements were made, and ultimately being able to trace people back, not only the movements they make after they were initially landed somewhere as captives, but also where they came from initially. And here's where the difficulty of place names and how names are recorded, which has appeared in some of the papers. How they get recorded, and how you read them, and how cautiously or aggressively you want to read names is part of the challenge of doing this kind of work. So I guess finally the last thing I'd say is that, and this gets to Vijaya's paper, it gets to Jane's paper, is much of the time we're using familiar sources. Finding different sources is really important. What Matt Hopper's found with this incredible trove of volumes in Q, this stuff was sitting there. I mean, he showed me pictures of these volumes when he first found them. They were tied up and sealed, and had been that way for about 150 years in the British archives. Just nobody had looked at them. And so now that's been revealed. The work that Clara Boyer-Rosal is doing with the Froberville notebooks is extraordinary, and in some ways is a parallel to, in a shorter time frame, a parallel to the work that Dodie McDowell has with this remarkable Indian doctor in Muscat. Finding new sources is always incredibly exciting for historians, but asking new questions of old sources is equally important. And I think it's something that everybody at this conference is probably thinking of now. And I hope that all of us who have individual think we have possible new voyages, even if it turns out that they're already in the database, it's really important to contribute. It's been exciting to be part of that process, and to see. It's especially satisfying to see something get funded when it has initially not been funded. Matt can tell you more about that, but I think that this conference has been, I think, is a really exciting one, and I hope that the Africa Institute will be able to support more work like this, because I think it's absolutely first rate. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ned. We still have about half hour, so we have plenty of time for questions. We still have about a half hour, so plenty of time for questions. And we have the mics, so please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question to any of the panelists. I would ask you, though, if you have a question specifically for Vijaya, that you come to the front, because the microphone on the laptop, anyway, you'll need to speak into the microphone on the laptop.
Yeah, I think I have a mix of it's very general, but a mix of comments and comments. It's two mainly. One, I think, is maybe just very specifically discussing any strategies or program for disseminating this information, this database to, freed slave ancestry, how you plan to go around that in particular. So sort of a public information that will benefit these families. Secondly, I'm not being very clever here, but also, how does this project then intersect with studies that look into the way freed slave communities they themselves constructed their own ideas of where they come from? I think we saw this yesterday from particularly Preben's paper amongst Makua people, but also in East Africa between communities describing themselves as Nyasa, Wanyasa, I think generally meaning from Nyasa land, which is also a very sort of wide idea about where slaves may have come from, who are now resident in and around former slave missions in East Africa, right? So yes, there has been a general lack of information about origins and voyages, but there is strategies that communities have adopted across the years in terms of making meaning about where they may have come from. So what's the relationship between the two? Archives, if you like.
We could take another question. Yeah, we could take another question, and then we could turn it over to the panel.
Actually, I have a question for. And then the rest to come then. I had a question for Vijay. I've just recently taken part in a conference that was kind of questioning, interrogating whether kind of putting out people's names, the names of formerly enslaved or enslaved peoples in databases publicly, the ethics of that. And I wanted to find out from you if you had any kind of complications in trying to get descendants of people of enslaved communities in taking part in this change in historiography that has gone on in your projects in Mauritius. It's exactly the kind of thing that I would like to see kind of take place in the historiography of enslavement of peoples on the Arabian Peninsula. Because when people talk about it from that point of view, instead of on the other side of the power divide, things change dramatically often.
Well, actually, we'll take one more question, and then we'll turn it over.
Thank you very much. My question would be rather general. I enjoyed looking at the Atlantic, particularly the map itself, and seeing the ships going and the numbers. I mean, that was nice. But I'm interested particularly in what do you take it from it to interpret what it means. It's good to say so many millions have been taken, whether it is 17 million and people who can fight, whether it is 10 million and go on and on. You're just dealing with numbers. And what would be the purpose of doing that exercise for the sake of the numbers? And what I have mentioned occasionally is that those numbers don't become alive in terms of people. And unfortunately, we don't have too much information about what happens to those people themselves who are involved in that slavery. And of course, I know, but I've worked on the Gulf, the freed slaves in the Gulf, who had to write a brief life history of why they were recorded. And that is really slave trade really becomes alive. Both slavery and particularly slave trade becomes alive. Now you begin to see how many were women, how many were men, what experience they went through. It gives life to those. And I was saying that we should pay as much attention to collecting this kind of information, even though there may definitely will be smaller numbers, but they do become more alive. I think just the numbers, and if it amounts to just mere comparison, Atlantic was 17 million, and here Indian Ocean was 17 million. And then we'll say, so what? essentially, what you cannot say really much more. And also, and I think the question of time is very important. And what leads to this slave trade? What may have led to the slave trade in the 11th century, and what may have led, which we did lead in the 19th century, is really quite different. We need to explain what brings it about. Just the numbers and the regions do not tell me enough about the human aspect of slavery itself. So I was sort of urging to collect all sorts of materials. Like in the discussion so far, I mean, we have used, but these, the recorded, that we discussed a lot yesterday about the freed slaves in the Gulf. They are very, very useful. But when you come to use them, you have to be very careful. And I think, particularly in terms of the origin of those documents. So, for example, for the Gulf, people who are using them, they must realize the kind of biases are built into this category. For one thing, only those people who could complain to the British that they were being ill-treated, they are the only ones who went there to get freedom. What about the others? How do we fill that gap is also important. And so what I would say that let us collect all sorts of information. And how do we record them? That is another question. There would be not figures to be compared, but we should be collecting them as actively as we are collecting the figures. Thank you.
Vijaya, would you like to start? That was the last question, and we'll now allow the panel to respond. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yes, so I think the question was about how descendants have reacted to the search for origins and genealogies. So in the in only 20 minutes, it was difficult to give you the 40 years of research using genealogy and origins to unearth the history of slavery. But the project that was started at the Nelson Mandela Center coincided with another person I mentioned during my talk, which was Mr. Michel's campaign for reparations, but compensation for descendants of slaves. And when the project started, the Origins project, he saw an immediate opportunity for descendants who are part of his campaign to come and confirm their slave ancestry. So in order to claim this compensation that he was asking government for. So the Nelson Mandela Center was literally engulfed with requests for search for origins and slave ancestry and so on. So I think there was something like 20,000 people contacted the Nelson Mandela in the space of a year and a half. And of course, they were not unable to meet all the expectations of people. As you know, with slave ancestry, most descendants do not have documents. So this has been quite difficult for many to try and trace the ancestry. But we do have slave registration returns, which are now, I think, online on the Nelson Mandela site, center's site. But the difficulty we have now in Mauritius is that we still do not have access to birth, death, marriage, manumission records. These are what are called civil status records, and they are only accessible to people who can prove their relationship to a particular document, which is totally ridiculous, because if you have slave ancestry, obviously you're searching for your ancestry. You can't show that you're related to a particular person named in a document, a birth or death or marriage. So we have been campaigning now in the last 2 or 3 years for all documents that have any kind of civil status information concerning people over 100 years old to be made publicly accessible. And this is the international norm, 100 years. The public should be able to access any documents over 100 years old. So although there is a huge interest in Mauritius in tracing family history and tracing family roots, the problem is the official blockage of civil status records for us. And I also mentioned a few, the 5 big families in Mauritius, big slave-owning families and land-owning families, and you used to call the oligarchy, not to allow people access so they can to be able to trace their ancestry and trace their relationship to a particular sugar estate to claim compensation. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
The
so
last-
what I was saying was that in addition to the lack of access to civil status records, which is blocking now many families from tracing their ancestry, we have lobbying, a lot of lobbying going on not to allow access, because there are many land claims being made on the lands of former sugar estate or slave owning estates. And so this is another problem that descendants of enslaved persons are facing today. I've talked a little bit about slave hierarchies and people earning wages, but we also have what we call landowners, small landowners among slave descendants, and whose land has gradually been either taken away or just encroached upon by the large sugar estates. So they are trying to claim their land back, but this is also proving very difficult. So yes, there is a huge interest in genealogy and tracing family history among descendants.
Thank you, Vijaya.
I'm just going to say a few words in response to a few of the questions. I think Matt probably has a bit more to say than me about some of this. But I think the issue of sources that Ned brought up and that has come up again and again and now raised again is a very important question, thinking around sources. And one thing I would say, and I would urge us all to think about this, is about the ways in which our work can be collaborative and actively seeking out collaborations. For me, in working on Madagascar, I've recently, in the past few years, been working with a collaborator who is a historian in Madagascar who collects oral histories. And his work has been incredibly illuminating for me. And I am very grateful for his generosity, because he gives us just such the information that you're providing to us, right? That you're not going to find in the archives, that you're not going to find in the numbers as well. And it's just these sorts of collaborations that I think are incredibly valuable. But I think Matt was also speaking about the ways in which a database such as Slave Voyages can be a meeting point for these sorts of collaborations, for then also assembling other collections of sources that will tell us more about people's actual lives as opposed to a dot on a map. So while we're thinking through some of these issues involved, I think there's also real opportunities now with the internet. Now I can send emails constantly to this historian in Madagascar, and he very generously sends me his published works that are hard to find in the United States. I send him mine. Right? And so we're able to communicate almost instantaneously with one another. And so this is a real opportunity in my mind. We've still yet to meet in person, right? So these opportunities are definitely out there. And even the overlaps between various people's works during this conference, I think, is illuminating. And these are connections that should be maintained. And I think in general, the academy, at least speaking from the perspective of the United States, does not value collaborative scholarship in the ways that we should. So just something that I wanted to throw out there as we're talking about this issue of sources in particular.
Great, thank you. I would just link Ngala's question and Abdul's question about disseminating information, strategies for disseminating information, and then and Abdul's important point about the what you can take from it, right? The so what question. And I think one way is through one thing that Slave Voyages does really effectively right now, although I think probably most people go immediately to the database or to a time lapse or something to find what they need. The essays are quite good. And so this portion of Slave Voyages will also have supplemental essays that will do some explaining. I think personally I would be very hesitant to draw sweeping conclusions from the limited data that we'll be able to get. There are just limitations to the data. I don't know if we can make a sweeping claim about numbers. And I think why it matters, the kinds of conclusions we can draw, although I think that should mostly be appropriate in the interpretive essays, I think are these kinds of linkages and collaborations and the ability to connect different public humanities projects that individual researchers are doing for their own purposes with the work of other researchers, but also the descendants who are doing the genealogical work of trying to, I think it's going to really matter to them. And I think it's going to matter to scholars who are working on a project who are going to discover new sources about something they already know quite a bit about, but it'll be coming from a new angle because we'll be linking people together, linking sources. So I think that will be the big takeaway as far as I'm concerned. I don't know about whether the interpretive essays can be conclusive in anything kind of like a general census of Indian Ocean slavery that could be compared with the Atlantic. And I don't know if I would want to do that, frankly. I mean, I think there would be just too many limitations in the way of our sources to do that. But I see this less as a census and less as a quantitative exercise purely for calculating numbers or estimates of, shipping capacity totals or, the numbers, but instead as an opportunity for people who are doing microhistorical work, which I think is really meaningful, to find additional sources and to link to other scholars who are doing similar work. So I think that will also maybe help disseminate the information. So I think the essays should be there, but I think the outcomes are going to be much bigger because they're going to create linkages that will help disseminate information through people's research, much of which I hope will be very publicly accessible, but then also through public humanities projects, which are already out there, but sometimes less well known.
I just wanted to add just a few things to this. First of all, part of this project will be putting together essays, but also lesson plans. And then I just wanted to add that when you travel throughout the United States and visit various museums, so the Museum of Lynching, for instance, you can see the maps directly taken from current existing slave voyages maps. In other words, this freely available resource is being taken upon by public historians and broadcast widely throughout the United States. Now, I think our project is going to be to disseminate beyond the United States, right? But I think also in some ways, the public-facing elements of the website being freely available, accessible, lesson plans, and so on, makes it a bit more of an easy jump into this. Just by point of reference, we receive emails now that we've put this announcement out there, and I've received emails from a marine archaeologist in South Africa who is uncovering ships and wants to know if I have any evidence about them, right? Is interested in looking into understanding more about these voyages. We received an email from a researcher who is studying East India Company personnel that were carrying Chinese enslaved people with them from China to India. And we've also received information that brings us into the Pacific as well. So, kind of pushing some of these boundaries, and these are people that I would not have contact with, these microhistorical studies, but it's still a very interesting way to begin to work together as well, yeah.
Yes, please. We can take some more questions. We still have another 15 minutes or so.
Hey, Thabiti Willis. So I just wanted to follow back up on what I was hearing in Elaine's question that I think is pointing to an issue of kind of the paradox, right? That there. So one, I'll take one quick step back. So I appreciate very much, Jane, Matt, what you've highlighted in terms of a whole range of ways that this enables collaboration, connections among scholars, and even with communities. One of the things, in the context of thinking about the issue of silences in the Gulf is part of the issues around shame and around the cost of excavating aspects of people's identities and histories where, in that context, there's a different kind of burden and a different kind of cost, right, that people face. So I'm in some ways even kind of channeling in Habiba's, courage and vulnerability and, and being a bit transparent about just ways in which a desire to make some connections to aspects of our own origins and ancestry, but also a desire to disconnect from other aspects as well, right? So I'm throwing that as part of just, recalling and making the connections to thinking about how do we also, in talking, as we're thinking as well about the ethics and what makes the Atlantic world and the Indian Ocean worlds at times a bit different, how do we factor in those kind of ethical dimensions where part of the conversation or part of the factors mobilizing silence is the legibility that some garner from citizenship as Emirati, as Bahraini, as Saudi, etc., and how that gets destabilized and under a different kind of scrutiny where there's a loss of status, a loss of possibilities of marriage, other, kind of social benefits from being identified with connections to this history. So just kind of, and really pulling out Elaine's question and just, making some connections here that, for us to continue to think about. Thanks.
Thank you. It's a really simple question, but I know we're here focusing on the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, but the whole time you were talking, I'm thinking about all of the records that do not show up necessarily in the British archives that document ships being stopped or ships that are just simply docking with slaves in them in the Ottoman archives, and there's tons of them. So my question is there any... I remember like the slave trade was going north, continued to go north for a long time, from sub-Saharan Africa into Benghazi, through Malta on, or when they catch Benghazi, it will go somewhere in Egypt and so on. Then it will go north into Crete and then into, parts of the Ottoman Empire. And sometimes the British would stop them in the Mediterranean as well. So you'd find some of the records in the British archives. But sometimes they just make the voyage successfully, and then they're documented. Are there any efforts to reach out to people that are working on the northern trade or the trade routes going north, even through the Suez Canal? Thank you.
I'll answer the easy question, and then I'll let you handle Davidi's question, because that's a much bigger issue that I think we've yet to grapple with, especially because of the immediacy of people's lives. It's so much more recent, right? But in response to your question, we're reaching out to you. If you know scholars working on this, we would love their contact information. We will bombard them with emails. We would love to have them contribute. Most scholars probably aren't aware of this, but on slave voyages right now, there's an estimates tab. And this is because even though there's a lot of information in the transatlantic slave trade, they know they don't have data for every voyage. So there's significant estimates, especially in the 19th century during illegal slaving, in which scholars have looked at various census figures and other ways of estimating, and then they give these different numbers. And so we might end up doing something similar eventually. But again, if you know scholars who work on these topics, we would love to be put in touch with them.
I would say, Mustafa, your question also gets to questions of how we delimit the space that we're studying. So in adding an Indian Ocean tab, that also opens up possibilities. Will there someday be a Pacific tab and a Mediterranean tab? As of now, the first step is the intra-American, and that's really crucial. So adding the Indian Ocean will itself be a challenge. But where does the Indian Ocean end? So I was giving a presentation, somebody was talking about Africans who were removed from slave voyages on the Nile River. So that's not technically in the Indian Ocean, but it is awfully close. So should it be included in this? And I think there'll be some tough conversations about what will be included in this particular part. But the nice thing is that there already will be overlap between this tab and the transatlantic database and the inter-American, because some of these voyages overlap, and that's okay. The nice thing about the way slave voyages is set up is there can be these connections that are linked. So there might be a ship that does an Atlantic voyage, but it also might do an Indian Ocean voyage, and that we definitely have that happening. Is it possible there's also Mediterranean voyages that could be added that also have Indian Ocean components, or perhaps it'll be its own subset someday? I think those questions remain to be asked. To Thabiti's question, the ethics of this is a very important question, because there are a lot of these public humanities projects right now which are putting information that was hidden away in archives up online, and it's publicly available. And so you could do a Google search and potentially come up with a primary source document that links somebody today to their enslaved ancestors. In some parts of the world, that's amazing, right? That is an incredible gift to have that information. In other parts of the world, that might introduce ethical challenges for the researcher, right? That doesn't affect people who are just researching the archives for the purposes of obscurely published work that only experts are reading, right? Making something publicly available brings in new ethical questions. So there was a conference that Elaine and I both attended in the fall that is now going to have a dedicated issue of a journal, the Digital Humanities Journal, that will be wrestling with these ethical issues. And there are some people who are perfectly happy to put everything available online. Other people who are saying, well, wait a second. What does it mean when we're invoking, for example, in registers, biological information on people's height and descriptions about their physical appearance, and also kind of what we might consider biometric information, right, about the patterns of facial scarification and things that made them identifiable. Because as Ned correctly pointed out, those registers are not created purely as a humanitarian act of altruism. They serve two purposes. As Ned pointed out, number one, to calculate prize money for the Royal Navy officers and crew who are capturing slave ships. And number two is a form of surveillance. So if somebody absconds from their indenture and they're going under an assumed name, their facial scarifications, their height, that's biometric information will give them away, and they'll be able to be found out, right? So that's the other surveillance purpose. And so I think putting those things publicly available online, we have to do some serious thinking. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be online, but we do need to do some thinking about that. So I think those conversations definitely need to happen, because as people who work on the Gulf know, those information about family history matters. Even in the cosmopolitan environment of the Gulf, right, where officially these things shouldn't matter. They really do, right? They matter at times of marriage. They matter for inheritance and citizenship. And so that's a question we really need to be asking ourselves, and have a very serious question, a conversation that involves the communities who are affected, right? It can't just be happening in Ivory Tower. We'll give the microphone back to Thabiti.
So, because I'm thinking literally about seeing, the family Ibn Saud come up in some of these journals. And I'm thinking about the way the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund has been operating in the U.S., right, and in a number of places. And I could see it not out of the realm of possibility, given that amount of money, to just come in and say, I'll buy all of this database material and lock it up and throw away the key. Right? When thinking about what's at stake for those who are moving that kind of wealth, billions of dollars around, throwing it at golfers, etc., all about to try to control the brand and use that to influence politics within the U.S. So again, it can seem like I'm going way out there, but I think, again, just the questions about the ethics and who might find some of this at. Yeah, I think you get the point. Thanks.
I think that's a really important. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you, right? There could be. Can we edit this video down to? To be paranoid, but it's just, Yeah, and then and just to add, this is a new question, right? You didn't have to ask this question 25 or 50 years ago, but having things publicly available on the internet does change the question. It doesn't mean that these projects shouldn't happen, but it does mean we should have a conversation, especially with the communities who would be affected, and have some community buy-in, right? If not literally the descendants, at least communities of people who identify with the descendants, and have them be part of the conversation. Make sure there's buy-in and at least an okay. So I think it's an important question to have, and I think these questions need to continue.
Great work, everyone. Thank you. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. We'll have to end the panel there. But I'd like to, well, first, thank the panelists. Thank you, Vijaya and Ned, for joining us remotely. Salah would like to say a word as we conclude today. And I would also like to very briefly thank everyone for joining us. This has been amazing. When we've put together symposiums in this series, it's all on paper until everyone arrives. And so it's always really, really exciting to see all of you. We appreciate that many of you came from very far, and we appreciate that all of you joined us over the last couple of days. I think this has been incredibly generative. I'd like to also speak on behalf of not just the conveners, but also on behalf of the journal Monsoon. Rogai and I would like to invite you to submit your papers to Monsoon. What we'd like to do is to develop a special issue around the themes that have emerged from this symposium. And so we'd like to encourage you to send your papers to us, and we hope in the very near future to move forward with that issue. So again, thanks very much, and I'd like to invite Salah to say some final words.
I really want to thank everyone in this room and who sat through all these hours patiently listening, but is also enthusiastically, engaging with questions and dialogue. I want to thank all the participants. As I said it before, they traveled long distances and did their work and wrote wonderful papers and gave amazing presentation. I also want to thank Vijaya and Professor also Ned Alpers, who I don't think I met him personally, but I've always heard about him as a giant in the field and a great mentor. And just by judging by the number of students he produced or the dissertation that he did. So thank you so much, Professor Ned. And I hope maybe we'll see you in San Francisco, which is, I'm imagining, closer to where you are living. Anyway, so thank you so much. And I really want to thank Professor Abdul Sharif for being a great host on behalf of all Zanzibaris. So, okay. And the team that has been patiently working behind the scene and within the scene, Satan and Sarah, Megna, Aisha, everyone who worked really hard to make this thing happen. And then finally, I thank our colleagues, the three conveners of the conference, Rokhaya, Jeremy, and Uday. I guess they're all here, so thank you so much again. So we're looking forward to see all these papers as part of the next issue or the one after, in Monsoon. Okay, thank you so much.